everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mobile Final Fantasy Games, aka the games that UFF will not play. My name is Jake, and I'm going to be walking us through the review of Final Fantasy Record Keeper today. Just a little bit about myself before I jump into the review. I've been playing Final Fantasy games for about 20 years now, since I was in grade school. A friend of mine got into Final Fantasy VII back around the time that came out. And I thought it looked amazing, and I really wanted to play it, but not having a PS at that time, I had to get myself a copy of Final Fantasy 2 and 3 for the Super Nintendo. I played through both of those, loved them, did everything, and I've been hooked on the series ever since. I've played and completed every mainline Final Fantasy except for 11 due to my lack of PC and kind of the lack of internet at the time it came out, as well as many of the sequels and spin-offs. So how I got involved with Final Fantasy Record Keeper, I started playing this back in 2015, mainly as a way to pass some time. I was traveling a lot for work at that time and spent a lot of time in airports, hotels, and in cars driving places. I needed something to do to pass that time, so I just did a simple search in the App Store for Final Fantasy, because I think I was playing through one of the games at that time, and downloaded it and have been hooked ever since. So Final Fantasy Record Keeper. Final Fantasy Record Keeper, a little history on that. It's a free-to-play mobile game developed and published by Square Enix and DNA. DNA is spelled D-E-N-A, so a lot of the folks in the community call it Dina. So if I refer to Dina, that's what that means. But you may be aware of DNA from countless other mobile titles that they've published. They're pretty big in the gacha mobile space. So the game Final Fantasy Record Keeper was first released in September of 2014 in Japan and subsequently released worldwide in March of 2015, creating about a 6-month lag that still exists today, and really what we call it in the global community is the global foresight. So things come out in Japan 6 months prior to global. We're able to see and translate what comes out and kind of wait for it and let that dictate how people play the game here on the global scale. The game features pixelated versions of Final Fantasy characters from Final Fantasy 1 all the way through Final Fantasy 15, as well as Type 0, Tactics, and various sequels and spin-offs in there as well. The main characters for the game in Final Fantasy Record Keeper does have a unique story and unique main characters. They were designed by series staple Tetsuya Nomura, and the game was commenced in the Final Fantasy VII realm in order to draw in American audiences. The game features a stamina bar like many mobile games, as well as an in-game currency and the microtransactions that everyone knows and loves. The game is considered a gacha game, G-A-C-H-A. Basically what that means is it's modeled after the Japanese gashapon machines, which are famously found in the Dreamcast classic Shenmue. Basically you put in some coins, spin the knob, and get a character or a toy or something. It can be thought of similar to like a lottery, where you're basically throwing in money or throwing in this in-game currency and drawing specific relics for characters that you love. So that's it for the history as it relates to Final Fantasy Record Keeper. There's really not too much. The game was announced a few months before it went live, and there's really not too much. It seems like Square came up with the initial idea and wanted a mobile game, and then contracted with DNA or Dina to get that done. The story for Final Fantasy Record Keeper centers around a royal archivist named Tyro. Tyro is the apprentice of Dr. Mogg, and he's working in the archives of a specific land to protect the records of past games. Basically, their work focuses on preserving these records, which are essentially photos of scenes from old Final Fantasy games, as well as a new story made for the game itself. So really, it's just kind of a way to tie in the fact that we're playing this kind of mobile, nostalgia-based game here into having something that can move it along and progress as we get to harder and more difficult dungeons. Tyro is also accompanied by a cast of other characters, including Sid, Biggs, and Wedge, as well as a couple other new characters. Probably the most prominent new character is named Alara, who is basically the female version of Tyro. They're two of the most useful characters in the game. Alara really focuses on healing, whereas Tyro is more of kind of a do-everything, but mainly a support-type character. So overall, while the story is quite extensive, it's fairly weak and primarily meant as a method to facilitate gameplay. I don't know how many cutscenes there'll be where you'll have like Biggs and Wedge and Tyro kind of arguing about something with Dr. Mogg, and it's all just really a way to get into the corrupted record or the corrupted painting to beat down the bad guy that's in there. So some will probably be not upset for not delving into the story more, but really I don't think that most people are playing this game to find out what Tyro is getting up to. I think people are really playing this for the nostalgia and for that great Final Fantasy ATB combat. So with that, I'll move into gameplay. So gameplay is really the bread and butter of Final Fantasy Record Keeper. It's kind of difficult to know where to start when it comes to the gameplay in FFRK, as it is so extensive. So what I'm really going to try to do is focus on some of the basic mechanics first, and then move into kind of all the content that's available, kind of separating that into what's permanent content versus what is event-based or something that you could miss. So FFRK basically plays the same as Final Fantasies 4 through 9 in that you have a party of 5 heroes, you'll fight an enemy, and the battle is based on an active time battle type situation. So you can equip this party of 5 characters, and these 5 characters can be from any realm, any Final Fantasy realm, spin-offs, side stories, or unique characters to FFRK. You can equip them with weapons, armor, and an accessory. Each character has the option to attack and defend, and then to use one of 2 abilities. So you get to equip various job class type abilities to each character. And then they also have what's called a soul break, which is similar to a limit break. So when the character's soul gauge or limit gauge is full, up to a certain specified point, you can use these soul breaks. Basically, the soul breaks are unique to each character, or anyone that matters is unique to each character. But those are really kind of the staple of what's the end game content for Final Fantasy Record Keeper. Characters from nearly every Final Fantasy are available to use, along with characters from other Square Enix titles such as Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy Brave Exvius was a recent one, and various other ones throughout the history. I think Japan has some Dragon Quest heroes that never made it over to America. But the gameplay at its core is very simple and very familiar to fans of the series. So the actual fights themselves, they take place in a variety of records, which can just be thought of as dungeons. I'm going to start with the most permanent of these content, and then move to the timed out content. So the first type of dungeon that's available to players, and in the intro when I talked about how they opened up Final Fantasy VII as a realm first to get American players in, these are what's called realm dungeons. So realm dungeons are available for each of the numbered Final Fantasies, as well as various spin-offs and sequels. Basically, each realm has various dungeons that can range from 1 to 4 fights per dungeon, and they center around typically an iconic boss or an iconic area of that specific game itself. So in Final Fantasy VII, I think the first realm dungeon that you have access to, you're going to fight the Airbuster. And that's a 4-stage fight where you get to Airbuster at the end and get to beat him up. And then it just kind of progresses from there and just follows the story throughout FF7 as well as every single other Final Fantasy. Realm dungeons are really great in that they kind of hit that nostalgia bug of games past, as well as presenting you with kind of like a beautiful pixelated version of the bosses that you may never have seen in pixel version before. For instance, FF7, they would have had those kind of polygon type models, but for FFRK, all of these bosses are reduced into pixel art. It's really pretty, and it's really cool to see some of these FF bosses in the classic style of Final Fantasies 4 through 6. Honestly, to me, much of the art, much of the pixel bosses kind of looks more appealing than the actual bosses themselves. And I'm thinking specifically of Final Fantasies like kind of like 8 through 10, where they were into 3D graphics at that time, but the 3D graphics really didn't portray the boss in such a way that looks good by today's standards. But the cool thing about the pixel graphics is that they're kind of timeless, and they look great being transformed into those pixel art forms. So after the Realm Dungeons, there's another type of permanent content which is called Record Dungeons. Record Dungeons are nearly identical to Realm Dungeons in that they recreate scenes from your favorite Final Fantasy games of old. The real big difference between Record Dungeons and Realm Dungeons is that the Record Dungeons allow you to, through a simple point-and-click mechanic, kind of traverse through those dungeons and those scenes from your favorite old Final Fantasy games. The story for the Record Dungeons really centers around Tyro and Alara and the whole cast of FFRK unique characters being thrown into these various realms. So your favorite cutscenes that you'll recall from old Final Fantasy games are interspersed with Tyro and Alara having banter, or some like inner monologue for Tyro or things like that. They're really pretty funny, and it's a great way to experience scenes that you've known about forever. With a few exceptions, the characters that you use in the Record Dungeons are basically part of a separate game. They level up independently. You don't really get to change the abilities or the soul breaks assigned to them. Record Dungeons are really kind of there to teach newer players how to learn the game mechanics, focus on things like how to break enemy stats, how to buff party members, how to exploit weaknesses, and things like that. They're really quite useful. It's a fairly new mechanic to the game, and I think something that has done a great job of getting new people acclimated with how the end game progresses. So after the Record Dungeons are the first level of kind of high-end content. These are the Nightmare and Magicite Dungeons. So these represent kind of a separate story from the main Record Dungeon and Realm Dungeon story. And until recently, these were the ultimate endgame content. Basically what veterans would grind for to kind of get those max stat boosts that any type of longtime MMO player would be familiar with. So the Nightmare Dungeons themselves, they feature a series of fights that attempt to teach you specific mechanics and capabilities of Final Fantasy Record Keeper's battle. Often a fight will center around one specific mechanic that without the aid of power creep. So if you're playing this as of when the content dropped, you really wouldn't be able to win unless you focused on that specific mechanic and focused on how the game wants you to beat that dungeon. I can think of one example where the game wants you to use all white magic or holy type magic. I believe it's the dead version of the Everett fight from Final Fantasy X. But at the time when that first came out, white magic abilities didn't really exist. So players had to come up with creative ideas such as like using cures on the boss and things like that. So really, again, it's just to kind of teach people the breadth of the abilities that are available in the game, and kind of how you can customize your parties and how you can use different abilities to beat specific bosses. With each win in a Nightmare Dungeon, you would unlock a new ability that you can then create. These were the first, what's referred to as 6-star abilities. All abilities have a rank from 1 to 6 stars. These were the first 6 stars. They've kind of all been outpaced at this time, with the exception of the healing one. But they are still there, and they are still available for everyone. So after the Nightmare Dungeons were complete, there was about a 6-month lag, I believe, and then the Magislight Dungeons were opened. So the Magislight Dungeons are an extension on the Nightmare Dungeons. Basically, characters will fight a iconic boss from a past Final Fantasy game, really focusing on a specific element. So you'll fight the main 6 elements, being like earth, lightning, water, ice, fire, wind, and then holy and darkness as well. So every time you beat a Magicite dungeon, it drops a Magicite that you're allowed to equip to your party. You can have 5 Magicite equipped at one time. These Magicite level up and provide various boosts to characters in your party. I'm not going to get into it too specifically, but they do get fairly complex, and people are kind of very into farming Magicite and creating an optimal, what they'll call, deck of Magicite. There are 4 difficulty levels for Magicite right now. 6-star Magicite are the end game content right now, along with another one that I'll explain. But they are some of the hardest content in the game as it stands. So moving on from Nightmare and Magicite Dungeons, another type of permanent content is called Moat Dungeons. These are one-time completion content that can be subsequently farmed. They provide moats. Moats are basically little things that you can feed into your character to increase various stats. They're called sphere levels. At this point in the game, most people that have been playing for a while have all of the moats maxed out. So these probably don't see too much action, with the exception of newer players. So whereas Magicite Dungeons are focused on a specific element, the final type of permanent content is centered around what's called realm synergy. So every character in the game is from a specific realm. You can just think like Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, all the way up to characters that are outside, like from World of Final Fantasy, being from the realm called Beyond, things like that. So when you go into a dungeon, it's based in a specific realm. Typically, certain content is not realm-based, but any character who's from that realm benefits by getting enhanced stat boosts, as well as like certain weapons and equipment that are in the game experience enhanced boosts as well when being used in those specific dungeons. So the Cardia dungeons are the endgame content that's focused around realm synergy. Really, it teaches players how to kind of leverage the power that characters have when they're fighting in their own specific realm, and how that can be used to help give you an upper hand. You are actually penalized for having less than a specific amount of realm characters in a Cardia dungeon. The penalties become pretty severe, I think, when you drop below 3 characters. In some of the higher end game content, if you drop below 4 characters from a specific realm. These bosses are from iconic fights in that specific game, and they really do a good job of like testing the players. It's kind of a gear check or kind of a DPS check, whereas if you haven't been playing too long, you probably don't have a ton of relics and a ton of soul breaks for every specific realm. So really these dungeons kind of take some time to accumulate what you need to really beat them. Nearly all other content in the game can be completed with a few select characters. So like, for instance, so you have Bartz, who specializes in multiple different elements. He can probably take out 4 Magicite by himself, but he would really only be useful in his own specific realm's Cardia dungeon. So really it kind of forces you to accumulate soul breaks for characters across the entire FF universe. Otherwise, you're really going to have a hard time beating this specific content. And then the last type of permanent content would just be your standard dailies that you'll find in any MMO. So these are the dungeons, like once you've completed, all of the other permanent content, all of the time-limited content, you can just log on, set your game to auto-run, and gather resources to, hone abilities or to upgrade characters, basically just whatever you want to do at that time. So that's it for the main permanent type content that's available. There is limited content available as well. They do a pretty good job of keeping this updated and keeping people logging back in. So every week there will be, a limited release of 2 dungeons, or not two dungeons, but 2 event type banners that focus on a specific realm and a specific storyline from a Final Fantasy game. These really give you great rewards. You get new characters. You get a lot of the in-game currency and things like that. And then also limited content will introduce things like festivals. They do a festival every quarter, which provides awesome rewards for players. And then other special events, like when Final Fantasy VII Remake dropped, they did a special event for that. Same thing with Kingdom Hearts 3. Pretty much anything that goes on in Square Enix, they're going to have some sort of time-limited special event in FFRK to commemorate that. So now that I've introduced what you can play, it's probably a good time to talk a little bit about how you play Final Fantasy Record Keeper. I will preface this by saying that about 90% of the content you face can be completed by probably any party, as long as you have the appropriate abilities and have a decent soul break for the characters you're using. Mainly I'm going to focus on how you would play the game in general at the highest level of endgame content. It is important to note that nearly every release of endgame content introduces new mechanics that kind of drastically affect how you tackle it. But there are kind of some rules that people generally focus on when they're building teams with how to tackle this stuff. So I will mainly go over how someone would do a 5-star Magicite. 6-star Magicite are just really too specific and too new to really talk about a general build for that. But a 5-star Magicite build could be something that can clear pretty much all content in the game. So like I said, your party has 5 slots. You're going to want to fill that with at least 1 healer, typically 1 support person, and then 2 to 3 DPS and a DPS support type character. It is difficult to have a one-size-fits-all, but this is pretty much the meta, and it's really focused around having characters to buff the DPS, to protect your team, and then to support the healer, as well as having that one person to keep your team alive. There are some specific builds that'll do like no healer, and basically you just live on 1 health and keep proccing a last stand, whereas your character will die but live, and then you just keep recasting stuff like that. But those are very specific, and in general, the party I laid out above is probably how you're going to tackle most content. Another thing that's important is to note that, oftentimes people will ask, like, what's the best character for Final Fantasy Record Keeper? And really, the right answer is the best character is whoever you have soul breaks for. Without soul breaks, you're basically just doing abilities, and while you can beat a lot of content, you're not going to be able to beat the highest content without these soul breaks. Each character can use a certain set of abilities, similar to like the job class that they would be a part of. So if you think of like someone like Bartz, Bartz has Spellblade access, he has combat access. Basically, I know in Final Fantasy V he can take on any class, but they basically kind of slot him in as if he was like a Spellblade type knight, and those are the abilities that he has access to. And it's similar for characters from every different realm. They all have that specific type of class that they're slotted into. Soul breaks are gained through using the gotcha mechanic, and I will go into that a little bit later. But basically, it's a gamble to get the soul breaks. So you might go into Final Fantasy Record Keeper and have a favorite character. I know a lot of people call it Final Fantasy Cloud Keeper because Cloud has so many relics and everybody wants to play as Cloud. But really, you're going to want to focus on building a party for who you have relics and soul breaks for. So a typical fight might look something like this. You have a support character who casts protect spells on the party. Then they're probably going to build their limit break gauge or their soul gauge, and then transfer that to a DPS character or a healer. They have this ability called Wrath, which increases their soul gauge, and then an ability called Entrust, where they can transfer that soul gauge to other characters. Then the meat and butter of the party is going to be the DPS and the DPS support. So a DPS support character would typically do something like trigger a chain. So FFRK has chains that are pretty similar to Final Fantasy XIII's stagger chain type system. So they would trigger a chain and then kind of focus on building up that chain. The chain provides an increase in elemental damage or realm damage, depending on what kind of chain it is. And then the more hits you get on that chain, the more the damage for that chain builds. And then on the other side of that would be your 1 to 2 DPS characters. So these characters really provide all the damage you need to win. So typically you're going to want to wait until a chain has been triggered, trigger the soul break for the DPS characters, and then just let them go to town. There's all sorts of different soul breaks for all sorts of different job classes, but really their main focus is doing damage, maybe imperiling the enemy so that they're more weak to a specific type of damage, and then just going to town. And then lastly, the healer is really just tasked with keeping your party alive. Probably one of the bigger mechanics in Final Fantasy Record Keeper is Last Stand, or some people call it Guts. I'm not sure which Final Fantasy this first appeared in, but basically your character would just go down to 1 health, and then instead of dying, they just proc this Last Stand and stay alive. It's a massive part of the end game, where enemies can do way more damage than your health bar. So understanding their mechanics and having Last Stand ready is kind of a big part of how you take them down. The only thing that I've seen in a Final Fantasy game that comes close to the amount of healing that's needed as in Final Fantasy Record Keeper would be in the 14 endgame, where you just need to pump out massive amounts of healing in order to keep your party alive. Most Final Fantasy games just don't have the requirement for the level of healing as Final Fantasy Record Keeper does. So that's a pretty simple explanation of one party-based approach. Again, there are endless setups. Most endgame content requires that you understand the mechanics and tailor a party to it. But there's really not a Final Fantasy game with more complex or satisfying party building and team elements, in my opinion. So that was a pretty basic overview of the gameplay itself. I'm going to move on into the gotcha mechanic a little bit and kind of go into what it takes to get soul breaks for people in order to make them powerful enough to tackle content in the game. So while FFRK is a free game, it's also a game that needs to make money, and Dina is very good at introducing gotcha mechanics to make money off of users. So every week at a minimum, there will be a new banner that features a variety of relics for curated characters. These relics will always teach a character a specific soul break or a specific action that they can do. One pull on a banner, and this is a full pull. You are allowed to do smaller pulls, but they're really not worth it as they don't guarantee you a relic. But one pull on a banner gives you 11 draws. Each draw has roughly a 12% chance of being able to obtain a useful relic. And the banners are set in such a way that you're never going to walk away without a relic if you do a full draw. So anything less than a relic is pretty much trash, and it can be converted to upgrade material basically instantly. Each banner will cost you 50 mithril of the in-game currency, which is roughly equivalent to $30. The price is pretty steep for a gamble that might leave you with nothing of use, but luckily Final Fantasy Record Keeper is very free to play friendly. They give you mithril hand over fist, especially when you're a new player, and they often provide free draws or discounted draws. Basically, you get enough mithril that you can probably do 1 to 2 pulls per month. People that are free to play often save their mithril for festival banners, which typically provide the most bang for your buck, as well as discount banners that come out around the time of festivals. So for me, typically what it looks like is I'll save up mithril for 3 to 4 months. When a festival comes around, I'll look at the banners that are coming out with the festival, look at what I have in my team, and what type of endgame content I'm looking to complete in the near future, and then focus my pulls based on that. There are additional extremely detailed grindy stats and stat enhancements in FFRK. I'm not going to get into those specifically here, but overall, this is kind of a pretty high-level highlight for the gameplay in the mechanics of FFRK. The grindy endgame stuff is what most people are on at this point. So if you go to the FFRK Reddit, you might see like a detailed write-up of how to maximize like 10 more attack points or something like that. That stuff can really be ignored for now as you start the game and as you get through most content. But know that it is very in-depth and complex. And basically it can be as complex as you want it to be. So my thoughts on the gameplay overall are that it really is fantastic. It's the best of all of the Final Fantasies. It's nostalgia to the core, but it is, I think, the most intricate and complicated gameplay that I've ever experienced in an RPG, let alone a Final Fantasy game. Like I said, it basically combines the best parts of every Final Fantasy battle system into a somehow seamless experience. You have, the ATB, just basic class combat of like FF5 melded with FF13's crazy paradigm shift focused gameplay, and it just comes together in quite an amazing way. Also, pretty much every class I can think of from a Final Fantasy game, with maybe the exception of kind of some of the very specific tactics type classes, are available in one form or another. You can have your characters from your basic white to black mage, all the way to dancers. I think they have Mog slotted as a dancer, which is kind of funny based on his mechanic in 6. But just really all over the board, pretty much every type of class that you might love is probably going to be here. Newcomers might be a little overwhelmed, but my advice would really be do any limited content that you can, and then slowly chip away at the permanent content. That limited content is going to provide you with new characters. It's going to provide you with great time-limited rewards, and then the permanent content can just be done on the side as really a way to build up your mithril stash and kind of get towards that end game. So I've been playing Final Fantasy Record Keeper for over 4 years. Like I said, I find it immensely rewarding to tackle this daily, whether or not it's like sitting on the toilet or as I'm traveling somewhere, just killing time. It's super easy to fire it up, get a dungeon or 2 done, use up some stamina, and then close it and come back at a later time. Sometimes I just find myself opening it up to like look at what characters I haven't upgraded yet and kind of plan out my next upgrades and things like that. It's really it kind of takes that mantle from 14 where you're always trying to min-max your character and things like that. So moving on to the graphics. The graphics for Final Fantasy Record Keeper are sprite pixel art. I would say it's most similar to Final Fantasy VI. And if I was going to put one word on the graphics, I would say stunning. Seeing my favorite character, who is Noctis from Final Fantasy 15, show up, in 1996 graphics when emo wasn't even a thing, it just looks incredible. The bosses from your favorite Final Fantasy games showing up in the same way. I can think of the Adamantoys from Final Fantasy 15. It looks great. And they really do everything they can to kind of recreate the boss fights, how they were in the specific game. I've never played 11, but I believe the final boss for 11, they have him very similar to how you actually had to tackle him in that raid dungeon in 11. And the same can be said for most of the bosses. So other than the 16-bit graphics and the pixel art, each soul break does have a unique animation. Often these draw from like famous scenes that a character was part of, or from a character's past. I can think of Shadow from Final Fantasy VI. One of his soul breaks kind of goes back into when he was a person before he was Shadow, and just a little bit of his backstory. It's really, really neat, and there's often Easter eggs for even the most diehard Final Fantasy fans to find in the soul break animations. There's a joke that goes around about Maria from Final Fantasy II because all of her soul breaks basically destroy the world. They like blow up the world, they're like cut it in half, and I don't really know how that ties into Final Fantasy II, but you'll see people post teams like Ultimate World Ending Team or something, and it'll be her with another character that has a soul break animation that blows up the world. So kind of funny and pretty cool. So to me, the graphics are really the main draw to Final Fantasy Record Keeper for a new player. Anybody that's played the old Final Fantasy games from 4 through 6 or even 1 through 6 knows what those graphics look like, and probably has nostalgia for playing those when they were younger. And FFRK just does a great job of recreating those graphics and providing something new to it, and providing new games that were never available in 16 in the pixel art, that great medium. Moving on to the sound. So the sound of Record Keeper largely follows the graphics. These are classic tracks from all your favorite Final Fantasy games. Typically they're tailored to dungeons and events, but they're always perfect. There's plenty of events. Like I can think of one of the FF8 events where like Eyes on Me was the main theme for that specific event, and it just always fits where it would have fit in the game, and they're just always really well done. They'll do these events where it's the Bra Bra. If you've ever heard of the Bra Bra compilations for Final Fantasy, where they release new tracks that players are allowed to get, and then all the tracks that you receive are stored in a music player, and you can set those to be kind of your theme that plays while you're in your menus. For me, I have it set to Vals de Fantastica from Final Fantasy 15. I freaking love that song. So anytime I'm playing it in a menu that's playing, and it just gets me really hyped and really ready to come back to the game and play it. So going on to the replay value for Final Fantasy Record Keeper, really I think the only reason anyone would play a mobile title is the replayability. FFRK really shines here. There's new content weekly, new endgame content roughly every 6 months. That endgame content will be sprinkled in every couple weeks, but they typically come out with a new mechanic every 6 months to a year. So like the newest, hardest form of the Cardia dungeons, which are the Realm dungeons, just dropped a couple months ago, and they've been releasing a new realm every couple weeks. And then there are quarterly festivals, which provide great rewards. They provide great banners and things like that. Basically, there's enough to keep you coming back to play at least a couple minutes every day. But really, I mean, for me, it's been almost 5 years now. And for a lot of people that have been day one players, it's been about 6 years of this game. So, really there's plenty here to keep you coming back. And then another part that I've really not mentioned before, except kind of in passing, is the community around Record Keeper. So Record Keeper has one of the greatest Reddit and GameFAQs communities I've ever seen. Folks will post 1,000-word write-ups on a specific boss mechanic and how to optimize your character and your buffs, and how to get them stacked up in order to take down a boss. They're really helpful to new players. You'll see like the occasional rage quit when somebody, drops a couple $100 on a banner and doesn't get what they want. But that's any gacha game that I've ever been part of. But largely it's a sea of positivity, in the realm of the internet, which is often just trash, especially these days. But FFRK, the community is great. There's a reason I've stuck around for 6 years now. It's just people that play this game seem to love it. It hits on all the things that you love as a Final Fantasy fan, and really with the new content, and even just existing content that you're working your way up to, there's enough to keep you coming around for years. I'll talk a little bit about the legacy and where Final Fantasy Record Keeper ties into the Final Fantasy universe, but I think it is kind of tough. Record Keeper's been around for 6 years now, which is longer than a mainline MMO before it became a Realm Reborn. But really, does it add anything to the Final Fantasy universe? And I don't think it does. I think this game shines as a compilation and a rehash of some of the greatest aspects of every Final Fantasy game, and really brought together in a way that doesn't add anything new, but kind of keeps you involved in Final Fantasy and kind of tickles that nostalgia bug that you might have for some of the older games that maybe you haven't played, or just don't have the time to play. There's a ton of people that have played this game. The Reddit community is huge for this game. But I don't think anybody's probably going to list this as their favorite Final Fantasy game of all time. Certainly I think it probably has the best combat and the most extensive combat of any Final Fantasy game I've played. But really that's just because it takes combat from every Final Fantasy and kind of combines it into one, and becomes something that's more complex than really any of them can be on their own, but provides just a rewarding and an awesome experience. So my overall thoughts on this game, what has it been about this game that's kept me playing it every single day for 5 years? They implemented a type of pension system recently, and I think I just got one of my most recent updates through the pension system for having been playing for 5 years. I've probably logged more hours into Final Fantasy Record Keeper than maybe every other FF combined. I might have to take 14 out of the mix to make that claim. But there's just something about what FFRK has to offer that I just find insanely appealing. And I'm probably going to keep playing this game daily until it gets shut down, until the servers turn off. One thing I will say is, prior to playing Record Keeper, I consider myself a pretty big Final Fantasy fan. I had a decent knowledge overall, but playing through Record Keeper, you upgrade every character. Sometimes you'll get a soul break for a character that you just never really cared about before, or maybe wasn't a huge part of your playthrough of a specific game. And it really allows you to form a deeper appreciation and maybe a deeper connection with those characters than you could have imagined. I know when a couple years into my playing, somehow Sid Reigns and Y'shtola became my favorite FF characters. I had played 13, and Sid Reigns was just a weird boss that had not well articulated motives, but in FFRK he was freaking amazing, and I used him in nearly every team. And then Y'shtola is just such a great healer, and she was my best healer for a long time, but I had never even played 14 and never knew about her, but somehow she was one of my favorite characters. And since then, with the advent of kind of the elementals and Magicite, my most used characters have probably shifted to Butts and Noctis and Rydia, and it allows you to experience every single Final Fantasy character and get new favorites. And while it might not have anything to do with the real game, it's pretty cool that you get to use them all. So really, it hits all of the nostalgia strings, and it does it in a way that's challenging and yet playable on a 10-minute commute. You can easily play this game anywhere and scratch that FF itch. I can confidently credit this game with exposing me to Final Fantasies I had never played in the past, and definitely rekindling my love of old games I'd played long ago, and even going so far as to go back and replay them. I can think mostly of Final Fantasy II, playing through the Realm dungeons for that, and thinking, like when I played this, I feel like I didn't remember any of this story, and it caused me to go pick up that Dawn of Souls version and crack it out again and play through it, and I freaking love that game. So while it might not really fit anywhere in the pantheon of Final Fantasy games, I personally think it's a game that any fan of the series could and should play, and I would definitely highly recommend it. Even if it's just downloading it and running through a couple dungeons just to see some of your favorite characters in that great pixel art. Even if you're not going to get super into the game or devote any amount of time to it, I would definitely recommend just at least looking at some of the art and kind of seeing some of your favorite characters reimagined in that pixel art that's so beautiful. So that's all I have for Final Fantasy Record Keeper. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this. Hopefully you all will download Record Keeper and give it a try. I want to thank Caleb and Joe for letting me come on here today and do this review for you all for a game that I love, and for the years of content that they've put out. If you like my review and you have any comments or questions, you can shoot me an email at jake@brulosophy.com. That's BRULOSOPH.com. Or you can tag me in the Geekdom Discord chat at Brulo, BRULO. I hope you all enjoyed this, and keep it super and keep it sexy.